Welcome to the next in our research seminar series at the University of Birmingham, UK. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Philip Auslander, who's going to be talking about his new book. He's going to be in conversation with David Pattie. My name's Graham Saunders. I'm one of the lecturers in the Department of Theatre Arts at the University of Birmingham. I'm going to be chairing this event. First of all, just to introduce Philip Auslander, in many respects, he doesn't need introducing, but I will do so anyway. Most of us will have probably come across Philip through his 1999 book, Liveness. And we were just discussing before in our little pre-meeting that a new edition is hopefully in preparation, or in the early stages of preparation. It's a book which I think through its various iterations continues to be immensely influential. Philip has been is professor at Georgia Tech. He's been in the School of Literature, Media and Communications since 1999. He contributes to a wide variety of different journals. In connection with today's talk, one of Philip's real interests, and an area where he again has sort of set the field, is his interest in popular music and performance. For example, his book on glam rock, his book on gender and theatricality in popular music. Sort of covers an emerging field, and it's also a field that the co-host today, David Pattie, also has an interest. His book, Rock Music and Performance, is again, I would argue, another sort of groundbreaking book in the field. David also has other interests as well as rock music and performance. He works in the field of Beckett studies, and also contemporary British theatre. So it's almost like a meeting of minds today. This is going to be a conversation about Philip's new book in concert, and I'm hoping that the conversation will give us a taste of what this new book is going to be about, and the implications for in a period where we have been starved of live performance for well over a year. The implications about what's going to happen as lockdown slowly lifts, and the implications for festivals, and indeed the whole idea of going to a gig. So without any more to do, I'd like to pass things over to David and Philip.
Thanks, Graham. I think it's an indication of the stature of Philip that he gets two introductions, given that the normal academic total is one. But this is a rather more personal introduction because, as certainly some of the students on the call know, I have been talking and teaching about performing in popular music now really for quite some time. And it's always been a slight annoyance, shall we say, that such a vibrant, such an interesting and such a culturally significant area of performance really hasn't had anything like the academic treatment for its due. There have been a very, very few shining examples of people who have been working in this area, producing work which is lucid, profoundly interesting, engaging, provoking. I can think of Simon Frith and the long-standing History of British Music project, which is now just coming to an end. There's work by Susan Fast on Led Zeppelin. But one of the most useful, and I think for an academic to be called useful, I think is the highest praise. One of the most useful academics writing in this field has been Philip, from the early years of this century through to the publication of In Concert, which I have read, and I will now do the advert for it. It is excellent. I think it is going to be a standard book in this field. It's something that we're going to keep on coming back to. Now, Philip and I have discussed some of the topics that are raised in concepts, and what we're going to do is just kind of talk through them, and then there'll be space for questions at the end of this. So, Philip, I'm now going to throw things over to you. The introductions will now finish. You'll be very glad to hear. I think it'd be very interesting to start off, first of all, just with a general sense of how your thoughts on the idea of performance in popular music evolved, and what were the staging posts that have led you to where you are just now?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David, for your introduction. Thank you, Graham, for your introduction. And thank you for inviting me to do this. It's a great pleasure. The evolution. Okay, so that's to some degree charted in the arrangement of the materials in the book, in concert. Though I will also say that I was at great pains actually not to simply organize the materials in sort of chronological order of when I had come up with them. But the first chapter is kind of the first piece along these lines that I published, and it refers to popular music and performance analysis. And so that was really the starting point for me, was the idea that for some reason that I couldn't fathom, the practice of performance analysis, which had been elaborated in some detail within theater studies. And I'm sure some of you out there know Patrice Pavis's famous performance analysis list of questions or checklist, which is pages and pages long, and allows for a very detailed dismantling and interpretation of primarily theatrical performances. And Pavis specifically says that, you can't analyze music performances this way, and you can't even analyze opera, according to him, in that way. And so to me, that just seemed like a very curious gap, because it's pretty self-evident that musical performances, whether popular music or not, are performances, and therefore should be subject to similar kind of analytical techniques as any other kind of performance. So that was really the starting point for me. It's just sort of, why isn't this happening? And so I just sort of, and that's why that first essay is somewhat, I don't know, self-consciously called a manifesto, because I really was trying to, say that this is something that ought to be going on. There's no reason why we can't take musical performances and analyze them using the questions. It's not really techniques. It's more like the questions that we ask of theatrical performances. So that was the first part of it. And then that sort of led me toward, I mean, I think I wasn't fully conscious of this, but it evolved of sort of deciding that the main object of such analysis is the musician and what the musician is doing. And this, of course, was very much in response to the kind of musicological position that what musical performance is about is the music, the piece, the work. And I really, from the point of view I was looking at it, wanted to sort of turn that on its head and say, no, it's not the music, it's the person performing the music, right? That is the object of attention and of analysis. And so then that led into the concept of musical persona, around which this book is organized, a term that's meant to describe or identify the presence of the musician as a performer. And what was really key to that development was a decision that I made that when sort of thinking about, okay, so if musicians are performers, what kind of performers are they? And since my largest experience as a performer is as an actor, acting is always my default model for what performance is. I don't think I'm unique in that. And so that was sort of my starting point. Can we talk about, musicians somehow as actors? But to me, I just kept hitting up against the sort of idea that whereas the actor's job is to portray a fictional character. Musicians, for the most part, do not do that, right? I mean, there are cases where they do, but what I would consider to be the normative case, they do not. And so I needed a different model, and so it seemed sort of fairly obvious in a way and logical to turn to Irving Goffman's concept of self-presentation as a model for what musicians do as performers. They don't represent people other than themselves, but they don't represent themselves in the quotidian sense, right? I mean, it's a specific version of them that's constructed for the purpose of performing a particular kind of music for an audience. And so it seemed to make sense to go with Goffman on that, and that proved to be very fruitful. The one mistake that I made, which I later corrected, I mean, it's my opinion that it was a mistake. No one ever complained about it. Is that I forgot that Goffman's notion of self-presentation encompasses both, shall we say, real and fictional self-representation. So that distinction I was making early on between acting and musical performance, fictional character versus not, was sort of unnecessary, because going with the idea of self-presentations can be fictional or not, right? So that's no longer so much a question.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I suppose an interesting example of that would be Beyonce morphing into Sasha Fierce, but then talking about Sasha Fierce not as a separate fictional construct, but as essentially a persona that she adopts, essentially to kind of deal with her stage fright. And it's a way of ensuring that the presentation of the self within the event actually happens, so that the thing can function.
Yeah, well, I will admit, first of all, that when I look at these things, I look at them primarily from the spectatorial point of view. So I wouldn't necessarily know that that's why Beyonce was doing that. But I will say, and I don't mind presenting this as a somewhat unresolved issue. So following Simon Frith, in fact, I posit that the persona is made up, or there are sort of three entities involved. One is the musician just as a human being, as a person. The second is the musical persona, that is that person as a musician. And then there's a third level, which I call character, which comes in when there is a fictional representation going on. And the simplest example of that is just anytime someone sings a song and they portray the character, in that song through their performance of it. And that character is usually not them, although sometimes it could be. But so that's sort of the most obvious way in which that comes in. But although I do think this vocabulary is useful, actually, for breaking this down and for talking about some relationships between things, I don't mind admitting that in cases like, say, David Bowie and Ziggy Stardust, or Beyonce and Sasha Fierce, it's kind of a toss-up as to whether one wants to think of those entities as personae or as characters, right? And my kind of default is that Ziggy Stardust and Sasha Fierce are not personae, they are characters, right? In other words, the persona is Beyonce, right? Or David Bowie. And of course, in both cases, it's handy that those are stylized versions of their names. So the person is Beyonce, the persona is Beyonce, and then Sasha Fierce is a character that Beyonce portrays, on stage. Through the persona, though, I mean, that's the point that I'm making. It's the persona that's portraying Sasha Fierce. It's not some other entity. It's not the real person, right? So that adds a complication, and I'm not saying it's an issue that's that I feel is completely nailed down. And in some cases, it's very, very ambiguous, and there are certainly performers who play on that ambiguity. But I still think at least allows us to have the conversation about what's going on.
Yeah, I think that I would definitely take the point that it's not something that can be nailed down, and maybe it's something that can't be nailed down, almost kind of as a part of the way that the form itself operates. Because it strikes me in terms of in terms of who reads the persona and who reads the character, and what's the intention behind, the conscious or unconscious creation of the persona, or the conscious unconscious creation of the character. There's a question of actually who is doing the creating, and is it the performer themselves? Is it the performer and the audience? Is it the performer, the audience in relation to the genre? I mean, there are all of these elements floating around the creation of the persona in a way which is perhaps ultimately unresolvable, because you'll never be able to assign authorship to a settled part of that particular network.
Well, I think there are. I mean, basically, I agree with you. We are looking at a situation of what shall we call multiple causality, right? In terms of how a given persona comes into being. But that said, I mean, in particular cases, there are, sort of traceable histories of how a particular persona comes into being that can be understood. I mean, one of the articles I've published since the book is about the Beatles, and that initial, well, it's not initial, because the Beatles, I also make a it's not really a distinction, but I also posit the idea of a collective persona. So something like the Beatles or any group of musicians, the group has a group persona, a collective persona, and then there are individual personae within that, right? And that group persona, it's pretty clear where that came from. I mean, I'm talking about the Beatles circa 1963, 64, right? And what my article is a very close analysis of how they actually performed on stage at that particular point. But it's pretty clear that Brian Epstein, their manager at the time, played a pretty large role in the construction of that particular persona. But of course, that's not the whole story. It can't be. I mean, you have the musicians as well. You have the audience. And for me, in the book, at least, I would say, and I don't mean to limit it to this, but in the book, the two things that I consider to be, or I treat as the most important, are on the one hand, genre, because genre has so much to do with understandings on the part of both musicians and audiences as to what is supposed to be going on, and audience, because ultimately, and this, there's sort of Goffman lurking behind all of this, but because ultimately the audience is the one that, in a sense, has to accept or reject the persona, right? It has to buy into it. I don't really want to get mired in a discussion of authenticity, which is a word that does not appear very much in my book.
Generations of students in popular music studies who groan at the mention of the word authenticity.
Yes, but I would just say that for me, what authenticity means in this context is acceptance on the part of the audience that the persona is a legitimate persona within that context, right? Within that genre context. And so without that, without the audience, that kind of audience, buy-in, then you really have nothing. So the audience also plays a critical role. And I think there's no question. I mean, of course, this can play a lot of different ways. That performers may, to some extent, adjust their persona to what they perceive the audience might want. Or the opposite, completely disregard that and say, no, we're going off, in our own direction. Which is the risk of losing some of their audience.
Yeah, which is the Phil Auslander example, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Where he, for those who don't know, where he turns up at a gig in the late 60s as a folk singer wearing a spangly suit. And the audience instantly reject him because this outfit does not ring the right genre bells.
Right.
He's
right. Well, he was so well established as a kind of highly political folk singer or social commentator, and then suddenly he shows up at Carnegie Hall wearing an Elvis suit, a gold lame Elvis suit, and that did not go down well initially. And that's actually something that I don't really get into much in the book, but I think it's an area of potential interest, is just to think about those cases in which performers do sort of manage to transform themselves radically or significantly. What I mean by manage to transform themselves is that they retain their audience. They retain an audience. They don't alienate the audience by doing this. Versus those cases where just less successful instances, of which Phil Oakes may be one. I mean, to me, the two examples I always think of are the Beatles on the one hand, who managed a really pretty remarkable transition around 1966-67 from what was essentially a boy band into avatars of the counterculture and psychedelia, and they did lose part of their audience in that process. But they did manage that transformation successfully, as opposed to the Beach Boys, who tried to do the same thing around the same time, did eventually make it. They did eventually succeed in that transformation, but not until about 1970 or 71. And they had a much, much more difficult time, sort of transforming themselves and getting an audience to buy into that transformation. So, and again, just to sort of go back to where we started, those kinds of stories also involve, many different layers of causation that have to do with the industry, they have to do with the individual performers, they have to do with their audience, they have to do with cultural change. Because I mean, if you just think about it, if the Beatles had remained what they had been in 63 or 64, in 67, they would have been done.
Yeah. Anyway, think about it. I mean, interesting too that the Beatles example is followed by other British groups at exactly the same time. I mean, but in the week, I don't know, you've probably seen this, but the Who Sell Out has just come out as a massive multi-disc box set, which if anybody wants to remortgage their house, I'm sure they could actually go out and afford. But that captures the Who at precisely the same point of transition, moving away from the short, sharp, punchy mod singles to something which is more, heading in towards progressive rock at the very, very early stages of progressive rock. The Rolling Stones have a kind of a failed attempt at it as well, but wind up with a morphed version of the blues sound. The Kinks go through the same thing, lose their audience and then regain it. So I think you're right. There are wider cultural issues that are at play here, which are, and I'm just wondering, just as you're talking, I'm just wondering what those cultural issues are. I mean, why are these transformations possible for some groups and some artists at some points in popular music history, and for others than not? It's a genuinely speculative, open question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think part of it. Well, first of all, I think that it's a very tough question to answer as a generalization. I mean, you really have to look at sort of specific cases. And I don't know, I mean, I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head how the Beatles managed it. But I think that in some cases, like I think, for example, in the case of the Beach Boys, the difficulty they had was just how strongly they had been identified with an earlier cultural moment, right? So that when people look at the Beach Boys, they saw this kind of, from the point of view of, say, 1967, this very square outfit, too white, too Southern Californian, too middle class to be politically or socially redeemable at that point. I mean, and of course, that's to some degree a misunderstanding of who the Beach Boys were, but that's who they were in the popular imagination. And I think it was just very difficult for them to shake that. So I think that's one factor that comes in, is just how strongly identified with a particular culture or an earlier moment a particular group is, and therefore how difficult it is for them to kind of wrench themselves away from that understanding of who they are, and convince people into accepting a new one.
No, I was just wondering while you were talking whether this comes back in some way to the idea of genre as a framing device. It strikes me that one of the things that marks the Beatles and the transformation in their persona moving through the 60s is that it's happening at a time when a number of music genres are being explored, and some of them are being birthed in London in what is actually an incredibly small musical scene.
Mhm.
It almost seems as though, I mean, all the musicians were kind of tripping up over each other constantly. And they were certainly passing each other on the new M1 and dining in the same greasy spoons. So that also connected to an audience, which at the time was self-consciously, if like, exposing itself to a variety of different genres. So the generic musical space was opening up, pushed open by the Beatles, and other bands were able to, if you like, take advantage of that generic explosion and the number of personae, the number of potential characterizations that came out of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. For some reason, a band that comes to mind in that connection is Deep Purple. Because I mean, if you look at their history, they passed through so many different, like, you know, genre categories, and they kind of flirted with everything at some point, right?
Yeah.
They had their psychedelic moment, that's then kind of moved into their progressive rock moment, which moved into their something close to heavy metal moment, you know. And so they and they pulled it all off. I mean, obviously, even still to this day. So I think they're a good example of a band that really kind of surfed the phenomenon that you're talking about quite successfully, and kept kind of morphing themselves and their music according to new trends as they kind of opened up.
Yeah. Behind this is the question of how audiences recognize generic personas. And would you say there are any kind of, again, this is one of these very open questions, but what are the rules that audiences play by when they look at musicians and assign generic characteristics to them?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that my sort of understanding of genre as a kind of frame is that it creates expectations as to what should be going on. Now, exactly how those expectations are codified, I mean, because they're binding to the extent that they are binding. They're binding on both musicians and audiences, and exactly how those are codified is I'm not sure, and I'm not sure it's necessarily true or the same in every case. But I guess I don't know what the rules are that audiences play by, but I think the audiences have a sense that there are rules, and that they kind of know what they are within a particular genre context, and therefore that they are in the position to assess the validity of a particular persona or presentation within the set of expectations that governs the genre. And obviously, you know, there are always lots of questions around that, such as the way in which genres themselves can change to some extent, right? I mean, they also can evolve without necessarily becoming something else. But I will say this. I mean, one rule that I do think audiences play by, which is, and I don't mean this in a negative way, so I want to be very clear about that. Audiences, to my mind, and again, as a vast generalization, there are always going to be exceptions, are essentially conservative. And what I mean by conservative is they essentially want the same thing they had last time, because that's why they came back, right? They liked it, they want it again, and if the artist doesn't deliver it again, then there's going to be a negotiation, right? And the outcome of that negotiation is not predictable. I mean, maybe the audience will rally to the artist and say, yes, let this person do what they want to do. Or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll say, no, this is not what I came here for. I don't like this. Goodbye. I mean, I saw that when I was reading testimony of Beatles fans. I saw that in a lot of, there's this sharp divide between the early Beatles and the late Beatles. And there were plenty of people who just said, when that transition occurred, I really loved who the Beatles were in 1964. When they stopped being that, I'm done. I'm not interested anymore. So I do think that the conservatism, in the sense of sort of the literal sense of wanting to conserve what's there, right? I as a fan develop a relationship with something, and I don't want to see that thing change because I have a kind of investment in it. Or if it does change, you're going to have to persuade me one way or another that that's a change that I should accept.
Yeah, I think that certainly changed with my experience of someplace else teaching. I wound up, I taught a course which was partly in popular music, and there were musicians on the course side. Always seemed to wind up teaching a very large contingent of heavy metal fans. And I think if anybody listening wants an illustration of the innate conservatism of the hardcore fan, the metalheads are the place to go. I taught somebody who could tell you to the precise note where on Metallica's Black Album Metallica stopped being a heavy metal band. And he would absolutely insist upon it. And at that point, it was like the shutters coming down, and I will walk away. And I think you're right. It's an extreme example of a general trend in fans attached to what they attach to. You know, they like what they like. And if that's going to change, then it's going to be quite a negotiation to actually make it change. So we discussed the idea of persona and basically what governs persona, and the idea that genre, if you like, is the frame. I mean, that does strike me as absolutely a very, very key insight for the way that performance in popular music develops. But I was really interested too, and this is an academic thing and also partly a personal thing, because although at the moment I've broken my wrist in that, so I can't, I'm a guitarist, and I've actually spent more time as a performer playing as a musician than I have as an actor. And one of the things that I was very, very interested in concert is the way in which you talk about the relation between the performer and the instrument in the act of performance. Could you talk us through your thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fundamental question that interests me, I mean, the chapter that focuses on that is a little eccentric, in the sense that the examples I chose, which are on the one hand, B.B. King's relationship with his guitar, Lucille, and a much less well-known musician, Mari Kimura, who's actually a classical violinist, but has a very experimental bent that led her at one point to compose and perform a piece with a robotic instrument. And it seemed to me that what the question that underlies that, and I think all the fundamental question of the relationship between the musician and the instrument, is the question of agency, and who apparently has agency in that relationship. And you can see, I mean, I don't think she actually, well, maybe she does. I'm not sure if Susan Fast uses the word agency when she's talking in her book, which you mentioned about his relationship between Jimmy Page and his guitar, but she's certainly in her descriptions of how he holds it, how he plays it, how he moves with it. The terms in which she talks about it certainly suggest something like that it's a staging of who's in control here, right? And the same thing is true, you know, for B.B. King, which is, you know, in a sense, a kind of extreme example, since he insisted that the guitar was a separate entity with its own volition, that he had to sort of negotiate with in order to perform, right? So that's a dramatization, I think, of the fundamental question of that relationship. Yeah, so that really is, and I want to be clear, or try to be clear, that, you know, I'm not talking necessarily about actual agency. I mean, I presume B.B. King was fully in control of Lucille.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, he was the one playing it. There's no question about that. The guitar is an object. Well, some might disagree with me, but my feeling is that in reality, volition is on the side of the human being.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, the relationship is staged in performance differently from that, and that's what interests me, is sort of have this staging of agency in the relationship between the performer and the instrument. There's also, I mean, Stan Godlovich in his book, I think it's called Musical Performance, also talks about this in an interesting way, because he talks about one of the things that he's very interested in is, and I'm interested, I share this interest with him, is the idea of musical performance as a display of skill. And so one of his points is that in order to sort of display skill, the instrument has to be constructed as something that's in a sense difficult to use, right? That it takes skill, it takes practice, it takes, you know, that I think he uses the word treachery or something like that. The treacheries of the instrument that have to be overcome by the human performer. So there's a kind of drama there. And I think that's another way of describing a similar idea, right? That it's, but of course, obviously this relationship can be played out in lots of different ways, right? Where, you know, the instrument can be a separate person, as it is for B.B. King. It can be just a tool. It can be a dance partner. You know, it can be a prosthetic. It can become part of the musician's own body. Yeah, there's just a lot of different ways that this relationship is enacted or staged in performances. But just to circle back, for me, the question that animated all this for me is that question of agency. And how agency is staged in particular cases.
Yeah. I think for anybody listening to this who's played an instrument will understand what you say when you say the word treachery. You know, where you flick either the string breaks or you flick the switches and the damn thing just does not.
Yeah. Well, and that's why there is some kind of claim to be made for the idea that the instrument does have a kind of agency. I mean, in and of itself, right? Actually, Mari Kimura, the device that she was working with is called Guitar Bot, which is a 4-string musical instrument. You can't play it directly; it can only be played through a computer interface. But she also said that, I don't think this is in the book, but she said that for her, each of the strings sort of took on its own persona because some of them were crankier than others. And when she came into the studio, she would always be asking, how is number 4 today? Is he in a good mood? Because apparently the instrument is a little touchy.
Yeah. I'm thinking this links back to genre again, doesn't it? I'm thinking precisely of the way that B.B. King plays Lucille. We think of the blues as a kind of a hyper-expressive form of music, where the soul is bared at every single point. And it strikes me that the play, I think it's you quote him in the book, don't you? That Lucille, he says Lucille can only play the blues.
Yeah, or perhaps only wants to play the blues.
Yes. Forgive me, Lucille, wherever you are. Only wants to play the blues. But B.B. King also kind of plays the guitar in a blues way, with that kind of rapt attention. With I'm thinking in particular of the way that he puts tremolo on the strings. Normally, I can't do it with the proper hand, but normally tremolo you can do with quite a small movement. B.B. King, it's a full handshake, as though he's wrenching the tone from the guitar. So is there a generic frame around this as well that kind of governs the interaction between the instrument and the practitioner?
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think the simplest way to talk about that is just to talk about just really leap genre frames and think, for example, of how does a classical guitarist hold and play the guitar versus how does a rock guitarist hold and play the guitar. And the posture of rock guitars, which is typically is another thing Susan Fast talks about, holding the guitar down by your knees, and which is not exactly a great position for accurate playing, is my understanding. As opposed to the classical guitarist who holds it up much higher, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's very clear that there are genre conventions for how to play the instrument as well, and I think that goes hand in hand with the nature of the instrument too. I mean, one thing that I don't talk about at all in the book, but again, I think is a very interesting thing, would be the choice of instrument, right? That there are certain instruments, and I mean, obviously, like I just said, rock guitars versus classical guitars. Well, of course, a classical guitarist is not going to play an electric guitar, right? That's not an instrument that exists in the world of classical guitar playing. So that's one thing right off the bat. Again, another very clear example of how instrumentation fits into the question of genre as well. But I think it can become much more fine-grained than that. I mean, for example, there is this something I find kind of intriguing. There is in rock music and some related forms something that's very similar to this sort of original instrument trend in classical music, where you're supposed to play the music on the same instruments or the same type of instruments that it was originally played on in the 17th or 18th century. And I see the same thing with some, rock players who, if they're playing 50s rock and roll, they got to play it on a certain instrument, right? Either an instrument of that vintage or someone that looks like it. And I can't really speak to this in detail. Maybe you can, since you're a guitarist, but I don't think it's sort of arbitrary that Lucille is a Gibson, a guitar,
Yeah, I think it's the polar opposite of arbitrary. There's so much, I mean, for want of a better phrase, there's so much fetishism that goes through. I mean, it's not just guitars. It's really anything that kind of makes music. I mean, the same veneration that original Gibson Gould top Les Pauls with the old bridges get is given to first generation Technics decks if you're a DJ. Is that a sense? I mean, it comes back to, and like yourself, I've been trying very, very hard not to mention authenticity.
The A word.
The A word, which is known to generations of popular music scholars as the A word. But there is a type of a fetishized authenticity.
Yeah.
About having the right gear. I know I can talk. Downstairs, when I can play it, I have a sunburst Les Paul. And did I choose that because there's a certain amount of fetishization that works with my playing? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and along those same lines, one thing I take note of is, and people who play, whatever, bluesy music, soul type music, whatever, keyboard players I'm talking about, whether they have an actual Hammond B3 or whether they're using an electronic keyboard that can sound like a Hammond B3, because the Hammond B3 is this big clunky thing that you have to lug around. And I'm not going to take a position on whether you can get an adequate replication of it from an electronic keyboard or not. But you can certainly come somewhat close to it. And yet, obviously, there are people who insist upon, playing the actual thing.
Yeah, my favorite example of that is the old progressive rock mellotron.
Yes.
Which was an absolutely terrible instrument. I mean, horrible to transport. Given the nature of it, if the temperature deviated by a couple of degrees either way, it would go out of tune. There's a lovely line from the guitarist Robert Fripp. I think something like, tuning a mellotron doesn't. But new prog rock bands in the 80s or revival prog rock bands who play just now almost feel you have to have a mellotron on stage because the very physical space taken up by the mellotron, that says prog rock.
Yeah.
And it's that little stamp of, genre realism, which is a better term than authenticity, I think. Genre realism that the audience will then tie into and accept. Yeah. This does lead us on to, and I'm looking at the time here. Maybe this will be the last area that we talk about before we open up to questions, if that's okay. But again, it's something that the book deals with is the way that digital technologies and new mechanisms of dissemination, changing our relationship to performance, to musicians, and essentially to how we access and make sense of all of this. So could you talk us through your thinking on that, first of all?
On Digital on what?
Digital technologies, new types of instrumentation, that perhaps aren't as well visible to the audience, if you like, or is obviously tied into what we think of as playing instruments.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I talk a little bit about that in the book in a specific context, not so much in popular music, but more in sort of electronic experimental music. Although some of the same questions would come up in relation, for example, to EDM. And again, at some level, it kind of goes back to that question of agency and the recognizability of agency. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about this is the question of how much and how it matters to musicians versus how much and how it matters to audiences. So for example, in one of the chapters in the book, I start off by talking a lot about, electronic music that's either made with laptops or, maybe MIDI devices that people have created. In other words, interfaces where the audience really can't tell, either because they can't tell, there's just someone sitting behind a laptop, or because they're unfamiliar with the device or the interface that's being used and don't really know how it works. Therefore, they can't really understand the nature of agency, what the performer is doing to actually produce the sound, right? And I guess the question is kind of, does that matter, right? And clearly there's a spectrum of thinking about this. There was at least one laptop musician I quoted in the book who said, I don't care. It doesn't matter. There's no reason why the audience needs to understand how the sound is being produced. It's just about the sound, that's it. Whereas there are other musicians who are, worried about this, really, and about the sort of sense that there's a lack of transparency in what they're doing, and they want to find ways of kind of allowing the audience to understand what's going on. But again, then the second part of that question is, well, how much does it really matter to the audience, right? And I think my suspicion, I can't really say this as fact, but my suspicion is that it's possible that a lot of the musicians who are doing electronic music and perhaps even creating their own instruments, in a sense, different kinds of devices that interface with MIDI and what have you, that a lot of those who are concerned about the audience's ability to make the cause-effect connection and the legibility of agency in the performance perhaps are worried because they come from backgrounds in classical music or jazz, right? I don't know how much the EDM crowd really cares about this, about exactly what's going on up there in the DJ booth. And I don't, and even with, I know this is an ancient example and going back, but during the days of Milli Vanilli, I actually I was teaching a class of quite young students, and I sort of asked them about this, about the discovery that not only were Milli Vanilli lip syncing, they were lip syncing not even to their own voices. And basically my students at that time said, yeah, we don't really care. And it certainly was observable, and this I actually talk about in the other book, in Liveness, but it was certainly observable at the time that the people who did care were their parents. Felt, oh my God, our children are being duped and misled. And so that was a generation for which, that kind of thing mattered. You really wanted to be sure that what apparently was going on was really happening, and that what people seemed to be doing, they were really doing, that kind of thing. Whereas to their kids, I'm not sure if it mattered at all. So maybe that's sort of circle around to the question of the digital. That may be the question in a way, right? These, if we're concerned about these kinds of matters, is it because of our generational affiliation, and how much does it actually matter to the actual audience for these things, who in some cases, particularly EDM, for example, would be of quite a different generation. So those who grow up in the digital environment, that may come to seem perfectly natural to them. And these kinds of questions may simply not be on the radar. Right now, I think we're in a kind of transitional moment. where there's sort of enough of a kind of traditional mindset around that these issues sort of crop up and sort of come up against the background of traditional musicianship on the one hand versus new possibilities raised by digital technology, where you don't have to really have musical training of any kind. You can make your whole album in your bedroom, all of these kinds of changes. But presumably at some point over time, those will become the norm.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think it's definitely one to watch. And a couple of thoughts that occurred just as you were speaking there. The first one is slightly flippantly from a friend of mine, Sean Albiers, that I do books with, and he's an electronic musician, and he talks about the Apple Mac syndrome in terms of EDM artists, both in recording and actually definitely in performance. Because he talks to EDM musicians who say that they don't particularly care about the instrumentation, they don't fetishize anything, but every single one of them has a MacBook. And you go to EDM gigs, and you look at the array on the table, and you have the Apple logo staring straight back at you. I think the second thought is, and this is something which can lead into something which is going into the stuff that I'm writing at the moment, is that the technology in something like EDM is expressed in performance in different ways, and it's not so much how the music is produced, it's everything that surrounds it. When I'm thinking in particular of Daft Punk going on tour in the States in 2007 and mounting this multimedia spectacle with them, incognito in the middle of it.
Right.
And that in itself, if you like, sets a generic frame around EDM performance, certainly in the States. So the technology is not so much what's producing the music, the technology is what's carrying the music across to the audience, if you like, and how the technology replicates the kind of environment, the kind of club environment in which the music would be listened to. I think this is one that's going to be very, very interesting to watch over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any insight into this, although when you're talking about setting the generic frame, this may be part of it. But I am intrigued by the number of Daft Punk being perhaps the first ones, but the number of EDM DJs who disguise themselves, and like Marshmello and Dead Mouse, and even to some extent to the point where it's not always clear who these people really are. So that intrigues me, and I think maybe what you just said, there may be a point there about, in a way that subordinates the human figure to the technology, because we don't really quite know what that human figure actually is, or who it actually is, or things like that. But I would also say, just from a historical point of view, and I know that you know this, that the phenomenon you're describing is also a description of Pink Floyd, right?
Exactly.
Sort of hiding themselves in this giant spectacle, or earlier than that, hiding themselves in their light show, where I seem to remember that you write quite nicely about this, about they're not wanting to be seen and not being much to see when you do see them. So that, and I think that was a trend of the time also. I mean, and in the book when I'm talking about light shows, that's part of it. That I didn't say this in the book, but there's this actually very funny thing that I recommend to everyone. It's a video that you can see on YouTube of Jefferson Airplane performing, I think in 1970, at the Fillmore East, and it's where they're doing wooden ships, I believe. And there's this incredibly beautiful, spectacular light show behind them. And if you watch the video, what you see, so the opening frames of the video, you see the band down on the stage, you see this magnificent display above them. And then as the video goes on, the camera person slowly raises the camera so that by the end, all you're seeing is the light show. because the musicians are so boring to look at. Even the camera person couldn't stay focused, couldn't keep both things in frame because his or her attention just drifted to this much more spectacular thing above them. So I think there's a lot bigger story to tell here about that sort of subordination of the human figure to the technical display, which whether we're talking about 60s light shows or EDM, and so it might be interesting to kind of try to put all that together into the story.
I think I would definitely agree with that. It also strikes me that, and I know that I'm using this as a way to kind of look back to the beginning before questions, if that's okay, but also Dead Mouse's Head, the Daft Punk helmets, the fact that if you went to see Orbital in the 90s, you couldn't see them, you could just see the lights on the outside of their heads. Again, it raises that relation between, you know, the actual person, the performance persona, and what might be imputed to be a character within this particular set of generic frames, which is, if you like, kind of where we came in.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, yes.
Yeah. That is that okay if we wrap up our back and forth conversation here and invite questions?
That'd be great.
Yeah.
What I'd add is people can either decide to put their hand up digitally, or they can actually put their questions into the chat function, and then I can sift them through and deliver them to both of you. So I don't know if anyone would like to start proceedings off. There was a lot of, but also just to thank as well, Philip and David. There, you got through everything from prog, from the mellotron, from the mellotron to early 1950s rock and roll via the Beatles and Beyonce. So I think you've covered a great amount of rock history and some of the sort of key concepts such as authenticity and stage persona. So if anyone would like to turn on their mellotron or their Rickenbacker, Hannah Lang has raised her hand.
Hi, I had a question about, I think just the last thing we were talking about, and the notion of like EDM and, you know, control of the instrument, that maybe it's not that necessary. But then I was thinking about maybe to what extent can you detect emotionality in EDM? Because I think what a prevalent thing is when you play on an instrument, that you decide on the emotions or the speed, and maybe that's a thing that EDM loses in some regard, that kind of human factor. So I guess, yeah, I think what would you think about that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, in a literal sense, I guess you're right. Although, I mean, obviously EDM DJs do control speed, dynamics, you know, things like that, through the way they, well, just the settings. But I think to me, maybe the better answer is that all of those things are still there in the figure of the DJ, right? And in that human being who's, you know, jumping around and, you know, doing all the things that they do. The other thing is, this may not be as true anymore, but I did notice years ago when I was watching some video of club DJs that, well, and actually I took a look at a Berlin, some video of a Berlin club DJ more recently. I think I saw some of the same thing. What I'm referring to is the gestural aspect of it. Now, that's not always so easy to see necessarily from the audience, right? Because especially if the DJ is elevated on a high platform and you have a lot of people, you can't really see what the DJ is doing necessarily. In a smaller club, you may be able to. And what I noticed is that the DJs would, I mean, this is another dimension of musical performance that I talk about in the book. Skolovich talks about skill, and then there's also effort, right? And to some extent, musical performance is about a display of effort, and which also has to do with subduing the instrument and all those things that we were talking about. But EDM DJs sometimes do kind of make a show of effort. So I noticed in these videos I was looking at that they would like turn the knob, make a really big thing about turning the knob. As if it was this, incredibly difficult and emotive thing that they were doing. So it was kind of translating some of, I think, what you were saying about traditional instrumentation and how musicians traditionally use that as an expressive resource to this other situation where, of course, it's probably, whether you turn the knob dramatically or you just turn it, probably makes no difference to the sound. But nevertheless, they were still doing that. And you can see that even in larger scale EDM shows where the DJ is high up, they'll still like do something, make a big gesture as if, they just accomplished something huge. I did notice that in the more recent DJ I was looking at, where, it's pretty clear that a lot of what she was doing is automated, right? And it just does it. But she was still gesturing as if she were making these things happen on a moment by moment basis. So I think there is something of that that's still retained in that form of performance.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. And so often the DJ, even in the large scale events, the DJ is essentially kind of the cheerleader.
Yeah.
For the audience's responses, and also the emotion is expressed through physical action, but it's also expressed through the choice of music and the duration of the music. And in the large scale gigs, the DJ's role is to keep the audience up, keep the audience dancing, not absolutely exhaust them, but make sure that they, basically they boogie from the beginning right the way through to the end. And as part of that, it's varying the pace of the music, it's varying the various climaxes the music comes to, and it's judging that against the audience. So if you like, it's playing against the implied emotional state of the audience, and keeping that emotional state in as close to euphoria as you can get without overt chemical enhancement. There's also something else, though, and I think it probably takes us back to genre. And I'm thinking of, there's a YouTube video, and again, it's worth looking at because it's really entertaining, of two turntable crews, one from Russia, I think I played this in the class, one from Russia and one called the Exterminators, who are from New York. The Russian crew simply put the vinyl on the turntables and play a really nice little set. When the Exterminators come on, essentially they play the turntables as though they were musical instruments with the same kind of craft skills and tricks that Jimi Hendrix would use when he would play a Stratocaster. So the equivalent of playing the guitar with your teeth or playing it behind your neck is setting a beat going, spinning around, stopping the beat at precisely the right points, moving back and forward between the decks, and if the music says something which is particularly declarative, miming the vocals with the appropriate hip hop hand gestures, which I am not going to replicate because I'm one-handed here and I wouldn't do it anyway. But it's just interesting to see when we think of there being a split between the technology and the emotion contained within the technology that is different within the newer forms of technology. But those newer forms of technology are themselves performative.
Yeah.
And given the nature of gigs, that performance itself has a strongly emotional content because music's affective, rather than intellectual first of all. So playing to the affective reaction between the creation of the music and what the audience make of it is something that you can do with Technics turntables as well as with the Gibson Les Paul.
Thank you. Does anyone else have another question for Fran has raised her hand.
Yes, hi. So you made a distinction between personas and characters. Going back to what you mentioned at the end, about Daft Punk Marshmallow, do you think this sort of use of anonymity could be considered a form of persona, or would it be a character, especially in today's new technological innovations, like we have AIs and stuff, like some bands, for instance, like Gorillaz, they choose to perform with characters. So I was curious what your stance on that, if it's more a character persona or if it can be a mix of the both.
Right. Well, that's a really good question. I would say, first of all, I would go back to what I sort of, when I was talking about the evolution of these ideas and my embrace of Goffman and the idea that self-presentation can be, I hate to use the word, real or fictional or some combination of the both. And so, you know, certainly there is a history of bands, I'll just say Kiss as the obvious example, whose personae are fictional entities, right? Now, for me, that doesn't make them characters because they're still singing songs and they're still embodying specific characters in the narratives of those songs, right? As I said earlier, from my perspective, it is the persona that is performing those characters, right? So kind of going from that, for my money, I would see the EDM DJs like Deadmau5 and Marshmello. To me, those are personae. Okay, I don't consider them to be characters. It's a kind of nice environment for a persona because it's sort of pure in a way, very divorced from the underlying real person, and largely divorced from a narrative, you know, song narrative, although of course that does sometimes come in. And there's a larger question about whether one can think about instrumental music as narrative, which I talk about in the introduction to the book, but that's a very thorny issue. So yeah, I mean, for me, those would be personae. And yeah, so in terms of, now there is an interesting thing that I have sometimes been asked to talk about, and I don't have very well formed ideas about this, but this is more along the lines of these weird events where dead performers come back to life, thanks to what is actually a fairly old-fashioned technology, updated. And at least to the extent that I've been able to think about it, the conclusion that I've come to is sort of an extension of what I just said. So like one of the recent ones was Roy Orbison going around giving concerts. And of course, you know, the entity that you see as Roy Orbison is made from images of Roy Orbison and then motion capture of an actual person, not Roy Orbison, you know, put together into something you can see. And as best I can say, my current thinking about this is that that is a performance by the Roy Orbison persona, abstracted and extracted from any underlying human being, right? So in other words, the real person has completely vanished, and it's a kind of pure presentation of persona. And so I don't know. That's you know, that's as close as I've been able to come. But I think closer to the heart of your question is the distinction between, you know, real and fictional. And for me, there's nothing that keeps a persona from being a fictional entity. Look at Kiss, look at Gwar. There are any number of groups that have done this, right? So the question of character then becomes, you know, that of characters portrayed through the narratives of songs and similar things.
Yeah. Again, I think the only thing I would add to that is that you can see exactly the same thing happening with, I don't know if anybody knows, you know, Vocaloids. Yeah, where, you know, exactly you have, you know, very generic pop music figures registered digitally, with the barest indication of some kind of character attached to them, but really no character aside from what the song contains at that particular moment. So if you like, essentially it's operating in the same kind of way. I mean, it's using new technologies to go through.
What about the art? I was just thinking, David and Philip. What about the Archies? Those cartoon bubblegum characters.
The Archies were the Vocaloids of our time. Essentially, it's the same thing. I suppose persona constructed to carry the emotion within the songs, really. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to put the Archies up against the Monkees as constructed personae, in one case embodied by human beings, in another case not.
Yeah, yeah. And to put both of them up against BTS, which would also be interesting.
Two other people had their hands up. I know one of them was Heike Roms. I don't know whether you still have a question, Heike.
I do. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much. It's also a really nice format, I think, to have two people in conversation rather than a lecture. It's really nice. Actually, my question was going to be about the holograms, but I have another one, which is not really about concerts, so it might not be a very productive question, but I just wondered whether you had any thoughts of about how these days personas are often fashioned also on platforms outside of concerts, and particularly sort of social media platforms, and how increasingly fans also take ownership of these kind of creation of personas. And I know that you've written in the book about Nicki Minaj, and I think she has a sort of famously toxic fandom that is incredibly protective of her persona and actually takes great ownership over the creation of her persona and how that leaks into her live performances. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about, about also fandom's investment in the creation of these personas, and whether there's actually a shift happening.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, first of all, yes, the persona is performed not just on stage, not just in concerts. Going back a ways to the Beatles, I mean, one thing that I looked at and would look again at if I were doing more of this is their performances at press conferences, which were quite famous and certainly served as a great vehicle for them to present their collective and individual personae. So there's no question but that the performance of persona is not limited to the stage. It's not limited to music video. It's pretty much happening whenever the artist is presenting themselves publicly. And in terms of the fan investment, I mean, again, the answer is yes. And again, this is a fairly, there's some history behind this. I mean, one of the things that's sort of most interesting, I think, in that dynamic is precisely when the fans sort of impose a persona on the artist that they may or may not want, right? So Bob Dylan is the classic case of this, which I talk about in the book, right? He did not want to be the voice of his generation, but it was decided for him that that's who he was. And he spent the entire rest of his career trying to shake that. And to this day. So, and then a more recent example that one of my students showed me just, I think yesterday, to go back to Beyonce, is all of these images, fan-made images online of Beyonce as a religious figure, this sort of saintly Beyonce, or Beyonce as Jesus, things like that, which I don't think that's how she wishes to position herself. And there's some evidence from some of her songs and so forth that she specifically does not wish to be positioned that way. But nevertheless, I mean, it's a very strong, fan discourse that constructs her in the way that, for whatever reason, they need to have her constructed. And for me, that's sort of the keynote of all of this, is sort of, if you think about the relationship between the musician, especially in popular music, and the audience, it's a question of what does the audience need the performer to be? Okay, and then the question is, if the performer is sort of addressing that acceptably, that's one thing. If not, the fans may simply take it upon themselves to make that person into what they need them to be, as happened with Dylan and seems to be happening with Beyonce and maybe others. But it's also true that people like Lady Gaga, Nicki Minaj, do also, to one degree or another, kind of invite their fans, or seem to invite their fans into participating in the construction of their personae in various ways, and to create a certain kind of intimacy, or apparent intimacy, with their fans by doing that. And yes, social media is certainly a major means by which this happens.
Yeah, I think so. Well, listening to that's reminding me of the interviews that Dylan would give 65, 66, which are a bit like I don't know if anybody remembers the film Monty Python's Life of Brian, where Brian, the character Brian, is trying to deny that he's God, and he says, "I'm not the Messiah," and somebody says, "Only the true Messiah would deny his divinity." He says, "Okay, I'm the Messiah. He is the Messiah." That's exactly the same dynamic that plays out with Dylan, who is exhaustedly trying to bat back questions about his significance. And his non-answers are treated as no-make riddles and, Olympian wit. It strikes me that the one thing that's changed about this, I think, is the speed with which this happens.
Yes,
And I think this is where social media really does have a role. The transmission mechanisms through which you learn of the persona of the performer, they're far more immediate, they're far more direct. I mean, I don't think that we should underestimate the impact that YouTube especially has had in the creation of contemporary personas within popular music. Because YouTube is the one-stop shop. I mean, not only can you go to it, and if you're going to see somebody, you can actually track, you can see what the performance is like before you see the performance, because you can track the images and videos of the tour as it comes close to you.
Yes.
So you can confirm your fandom that way. You've got access to the videos, you've got access to the interviews, you also have access to the music. Forget Spotify. YouTube is the main music streaming site because it's the one that's free. And it's there, it's immediate. You click on one site and everything is there for you. So the speed with which personas are formed and transformed is far, far quicker, infinitely quicker than it used to be. It's the same process, but it's the same process on caffeine, if you like, or no, it's the same process on crack. You know, I drink caffeine, and not even my caffeinated self is this quick. You know, it's almost immediate. Yeah,
I totally agree. The as you just said, the process, the mechanisms fundamentally really haven't changed, but the velocity for sure has changed considerably.
Yeah.
Do we have any further questions for Philip or David?
Hello, I do have one question. Hello, Philip. It was a really enjoyable talk. I'm actually picking up on one thing that you mentioned that has not so much to do with the persona and fandom, but actually the moment where you kind of talked about the relationship between the musician and the instrument, and you refer to it in multiple ways as being an extension of their body or kind of prosthesis, or seeing how they see how this relationship takes place in kind of a multimodal way, or it's been also articulated in different ways by different scholars. And I just wanted to know what your point of view is on that. If you could kind of flesh that out a bit more in terms of, how do you see this relationship between the musician and his instrument?
Oh, I don't see it in any one way. I mean, in other words, what I'm interested is seeing how that relationship is staged in particular performances across different genres. I don't think there is any one way of defining that relationship. I mean, I liked I'm sorry to say I can't remember the author's name, but something I liked that kind of helped me into this is someone who posits ventriloquism as a model for that relationship.
Oh, Stephen Connor?
No, not Stephen. No.
So
this is specifically about the musician and the instrument. Stephen has certainly written. He wrote a whole book about ventriloquism. I mean, I'm not trying to endorse that. I'm just saying this for me was an interesting way of kind of opening up that door of thinking about that relationship. But no, I don't have any opinion at all about the fundamental nature of that relationship, because I don't think it's always anything. I mean, I think it's constructed and dramatized and staged in different ways according to genre, according to certain individual choices on the part of the musician, and so on. So I'm not trying to construct a singular way of understanding that relationship. I'm simply suggesting it as something to analyze in any given performance, and to try to understand how that relationship is being constructed and staged within a particular performance, always, within the idea that that performance is framed by genre constraints and so forth. But no, I don't think there is any one way of talking about that relationship. I would not try to do that.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree. I'm not sure I would have anything to add to that at all.
Hey, does anyone have any further questions for Philip or David?
Yeah, if I can go. Hi Philip, thank you so much for today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Big old fangirl here. We base a lot of our second year contextual studies around your essay and your writing, and it's incredibly informative to our popular music students. So thank you for making my job a lot easier and really enjoyable. The question I wanted to ask you is a slightly broader one. It is obviously incorporating persona and performance, but it's how do we make these conversations like the ones that we've had today, how do we make them more accessible for those of us who are teaching and working with young people and young upcoming performers, but also young up and coming academics, who are going to look at the conversation that was being had there before with regards to EDM in a kind of like, they could possibly have interpreted that as, oh, well, I'm an EDM DJ and I'm not really included in this conversation about musicians. I have a huge number of vocalists, for example, who are incredible performers, but they don't play an instrument necessarily other than their voice. And obviously as a vocalist, I am fiercely defensive of the fact that vocalists are musicians, and it is a hill I will not die on because I will beat you all. So yeah, and I'm from Liverpool, so I can fight.
Okay, say no more.
But yeah, I suppose I'm fiercely defensive. I think academia is a wonderful thing, but it can be incredibly exclusive, and I want to include as many people as possible. DJs should be able to come to this conversation, rappers should be able to come to this conversation, producers should be able to come to this conversation, and I'm wondering how do we open that up to people to be as inclusive as possible.
Well, that's a really good question, and in some ways, we need to have a longer conversation about that, especially since if you're talking about this in terms of, pedagogy and academia, one of the things one has to factor into this is the nature of particular programs, distinctions among departments and fields, and all of that stuff, because that's a complication. I mean, just to give you one kind of arbitrary example, years ago when I was still kind of traveling around batting some of these ideas around, actually Liverpool, one of the people who just by chance happened to hear one of my talks was at the time the head of the Liverpool Conservatoire, and he came over to me afterwards and he said, you're right, we should be teaching performers, musicians, that playing music is not just about standing up and playing the notes. You also have to, create a persona. And this came partly out of, that was his response. My thinking about it had come partly out of something that happened to me, which is that years ago, I was just happened to be passing by the Berklee College of Music in Boston, and I heard music, and I opened a little gate, strangely enough, and there was a small amphitheater, and there was a group of I think students performing, playing what I refer to as Berklee fusion, which you probably know what I mean, and which was great. I mean, they were great musicians, but I was sitting there watching them and listening to them, and I was thinking, these people have amazing chops, and they have absolutely no idea how to present themselves on stage. They have no idea that they need this concept of persona. So I think that's one thing that I would want to see happen is, it's not just about people like me who are looking at musicians performing and trying to use this vocabulary for analytical purposes. It's potentially also something that musicians people who are being trained to be musicians could be explicitly taught, rather than just sort of leaving it to themselves to eventually realize, oh yes, I have to establish a relationship with an audience, which means I have to present myself, and then, oh, okay. But it's perfectly possible for this to be something that's part of your formation as a musician. And yeah, certainly it's true of singers as anyone else. So that would be one, sort of one side of it that I would really like to see happen. In terms of the reach of it, I mean, I know this is a very immodest claim, and I apologize in advance for it, but I do honestly want this concept of musical persona to cut across essentially any genre, any kind of music. Any kind of music is performed. If you are performing for an audience, you are presenting a persona to that audience. So for example, I don't make a big deal of this, but one of the things that's in the book is the idea that even musicians like pit musicians, whom the audience cannot see, are still portraying a musical persona, right? I mean, for example, I happened to find a document from the Tulsa Symphony Orchestra in Oklahoma, which stipulates very clearly as a contractual matter how the performers have to dress, right? And so it's very interesting to see what they say about exactly what you have to wear, for a regular indoor performance, what you have to wear for an outdoor summer performance, and what you have to wear if you're in the pit where no one can see you, right? And it's very specific, black socks. You have to be wearing black socks. So even there, I mean, it's the same level of construction of that image as it is for the image when it's visible to a public. And so who is that persona being performed for? Well, they're performing for each other, right? The audience for the pit musician persona is the other pit musicians. But that doesn't mean it's not happening, right? So I really do think potentially this is a device that you can use to talk about a full spectrum of different kinds of musical practices. And so in the book, I did the best I could because I'm limited by my own knowledge. But there is a list somewhere on the publisher's website about all the different people and kinds of music I tried to talk about. But at any rate, I tried to talk about rock, I talk about jazz, I talk about EDM, well, a little bit, not really EDM, more like electronic art music, if you will forgive that term. Blues, well, Nicki Minaj, Lady Gaga. I mean, I just tried to cover as wide a spectrum as I could, given, and country music. That was, there are always these sort of, one thing I really like about writing books is that there are always these sort of secret things, reasons for doing things that will never be apparent to the reader, right? And so there's a certain amount of stuff in this book about country music, partly because I live in the South and I'm surrounded by country music. And so I thought, well, this is part of my world. I don't come to it naturally, but hey, and then the other part was because I was just getting tired of, using examples from rock music. It's like enough with the rock music already. So I turned to country music. I wanted to see what I could do with it. So there's actually a fair amount of material in the book about country music as well. So I tried to, give as broad a palette as I can. I can't do everything, obviously. Oh, and classical music. But yeah, but I totally agree that, as many different people as possible. The producer thing is interesting. I can't really speak to it because I haven't thought about it too much. But, there was just a conversation on Facebook about the obvious examples, Phil Spector, et cetera, producers who sort of put their imprint. But there is a Phil Spector persona also. I mean, for better or worse, considering how things turned out with him. But still, I mean, there certainly was, or Berry Gordy. I mean, these people are not just known by their records, they're also known, there's a certain persona understood to be behind those records or those enterprises. So I think, I think there's a potential conversation to be had there as well. I don't know how to do it. I mean, how to get everyone on board, but but I don't know. Just trying to promulgate the ideas as much as I can. I will say this: that I know my book is an academic book, et cetera, but in conversations I've had with people, once you sort of start talking about this idea, people get it very quickly.
Oh, definitely. I completely agree. And as I say, I'm saying this from the perspective of having used your writing in my practical performance lectures that I deliver and the seminars and tutorials that subsequently follow. And I've had, a student, a session bassist attempted to tell me that he didn't need a persona. And I immediately threw Pino Palladino at him and told him to go away and come back and see me. And, and he had a very different tack on things a week later. Yeah, no, I think your work is incredibly applicable. I think that it's it's a joy to teach it in many ways, because it wonderfully backs up the point. And you're exactly right, people do get it very, very quickly. They don't like to give it necessarily the time, but as I say, it's making it that applicable to, to, like I said, the producers, the rappers, these really up and coming, students who, and not always students, they're not necessarily in a formal academic setting. I work with a lot of artists through labels who've approached me to work with their artists, and I regularly cite your work, which terrifies them ever so slightly, because they're like, what's a citation? And they don't need to know what a citation is. That's fine, as long as they're learning, and they do, and they do get it. And I suppose it's that kind of way of like making it as accessible as possible. So but thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed today.
Thank you.
That's good.
I think we've got time for perhaps just one more question before we end things.
I have another question, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Bouncing back from this last question, could you say that then music persona then are utilized in some sort of ways as a commodity in the music industry? I'm saying this because I'm a music management student, so I look at things more on the business side. So yeah, because it sounds like it's sort of not a necessity, but in order to, as you said, make a connection with the audience, and I don't know how to say this, it's sort of needed. So yeah, if you think it could be used more as a commodity than anything else.
Well, direct response to the way you put that just now, I'm going to say no, not a commodity more than anything else. Okay. But there certainly is, I mean, yes, there's certainly a connection between this idea of persona and the idea of branding and the idea of commodity. Now, I will say, I mean, since you're in music business, you're not going to be so worried about this, but there are other people on other sides of the conversation that are. But I will say that, and I may have said this in print at some point, I'm really not interested in commodity critique. Okay, to me, it is a given that music is made, particularly if we're talking about popular music, but not just, okay? Music is made, especially in the country where I live, in a commodity context. It is a business, it is an industry, right? That to me is simply a given. That doesn't mean that one can't critique aspects of that, et cetera, but any sort of sense that this is somehow inherently corrupt or, inherently a bad thing, I don't really have time for. Because to me, it's simply the context in which this is happening, right? So yes, of course, persona, I mean, again, I'm sorry to keep mentioning the Beatles, but that's a classic example. It's a very carefully constructed group and individual persona, which were absolutely used as a key mechanism for marketing the band. And so there's no question about that. But my point would be that well, first of all, I don't think you said persona might not be necessary. I think it is necessary. And I also think it's inevitable. You present yourself to an audience, you are presenting a persona. I mean, that's it. And so the question is, how do you understand that process? How do you look at it? How do you analyze it? And I don't think it's only a commodity. I mean, certainly fans do not relate to the musicians of whom they are fans simply as product, right? Simply as a commodity. They relate to them and their personae in much profounder ways. Now, the good news for the music industry is that leads them to buy lots of stuff. But, that's not the only aspect of that relationship, right? That's not the only function of persona in that relationship. The persona is the interface between the performer and the audience. And it's an interface in which audiences, particularly fans, but not just, achieve a very, very deep investment and emotional engagement with. and that's that as much as anything is what the process is about. But yeah, sure. I mean, it's absolutely related to marketing, to commodification, to branding, you know, to all those kinds of things.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I totally agree. I'm specifically asking because I'm actually writing a dissertation on music personas, so I wanted to, I guess, give more as well of a critical analysis on both sides. So this has been very helpful. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I'll tell you, I'm giving a bit of tutorial advice last thing today, but someone that might be interesting to look at for this would be Frank Zappa, who creates a persona which he simultaneously uses, you know, quite overtly as a brand. So the Zappa icon, the moustache and the hair and the nose become signifiers of who he is. But the persona is also a satire on the idea of the musician as brand. It's also part of an ongoing satire about the state of America. Partly it's also, one gets the sense, a kind of a self-protective thing, in that the persona he adopts in performance certainly is very ironic, as though he's kind of distancing himself from any effects that the performance might have. I think if you're looking for somebody who has a multifaceted persona that is never going to resolve into any one simple thing like a brand, I think maybe Zappa's the person to look at.
Internal scrutinizer on Joe's Garage, isn't it?
One, yep.
One of the voices he takes, you know, one of the personas he takes on.
Mm-hmm.
We could talk all night, I think, over some of the issues raised, but I think it's certainly in UK time. It's time to uncork a wine bottle or two, or get supper ready, or the archers will be on. The archers will also be on soon. So I shall end it there. Thank you so much, Philip and David, for I think a really stimulating conversation. It's certainly made me want to buy In Concert, and certainly we'll be getting that, I think, for our library, and I'll be getting my own copy as well. So thanks again, and thank you also for all of the contributions. So thanks once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody.